Well, it's that time of the year again. We are getting into a new patch, and just like it happens every time there is a new patch or a new expansion altogether, people start wondering about which class is going to do well, which spec is going to do very well in the raid or in Mythic Plus, which is going to be the dark horse, the underrated, flying under the radar spec that nobody realized was going to do very well. So in this video, we are going to go over the DPS specs and try to predict what is going to happen in 9.1. Now, this is a very tricky topic. If you remember, a great community member, King Boomer of the World of Warcraft community, Preach. I remember back in BFA when he made his video about the upcoming raid tier in Nyalotha, signing the hunters' names on their tombstone, declaring them a dead spec that wasn't going nowhere. And then we got Beast Mastery Hunter in Nyalotha. Yeah. To be fair, Mike has never been a very good predictor when it comes to this type of stuff, but it is tricky, you know, trying to gauge, trying to understand and predict how specs are going to do, how are they going to be powerful, especially when we are in the buzz right before it actually launches. So there are still bugs, there are still, you know, traits not working, conduits not working, people are trying to sim left and right, and they don't even know if the sims are properly correct. And then we also know, we have known for a long time that it's not that once you see a spec on a sim doing very well, you know for a fact it's going to be meta, it's going to be OP. Just to give you a little hint, this is what we have had for the last few months of 9.0.5 of live Shadowlands. You know, Feral Druid, even Demonology Warlock, as well as Arcane Mage have been doing very well on sims, technically being the strongest single target specs on paper. Right, on paper, which is exactly the problem of sims. And it becomes even more prevalent, even more prominent once you're not even sure that those sims are completely correct and reliable, which is exactly why it is such an entertaining period of the expansion. These type of predictions, these types of calls, bold calls about which specs are going to do fine or which specs are doomed, etc, etc. So we're going to jump into the DPS, because, you know, the DPS is the more important one, you know, tanks and healers, plus you also have to say that being able to gauge the power of tanks and healers before you actually see them in action is much harder, you know. DPS have their sims, right, they have their ways to measure themselves before the tier and the content is actually available, but for a tank and a healer it's much more difficult. Let's start with Warlocks. The first main thing to point out about Warlocks is that there should be a power shift. Many Warlock mains and Warlock experts are predicting the change between Affliction and Destruction. Yes, in all of this, Demonology is still technically the best simming spec and the strongest spec on paper, and it has remained like this for several months. Demonology has still been simming very well before 9.1 and right now in 9.1 with working sims for the specs. However, nobody really cares. The discussion is more between Affliction and Destruction. Affliction has gotten nerfed quite significantly in 9.1, or it's about to be nerfed in 9.1 in a couple of days. The reasoning by Blizzard was to nerf their single target to buff the damage of their dots, so that they became again a more prominent, you know, spread cleave, dot cleaving, multi-dotting type of spec. In Shadowlands we have gotten this weird scenario where Shadow Priest and Affliction, the specs that had this type of playstyle as their core, turned out of nowhere into some very high single target turret damage specs that did very high single target damage and much lower, you know, cleave damage. So Blizzard tried to revert this status quo by making their dots do more damage and their single target do less damage. Devouring Plague for Shadow Priest and Malefic Rapture for Affliction. This has hurt Affliction more than Shadow Priest, we can say. It has also hurt them because there is a problem with Sanctum of Domination, which is the fact that there aren't many council fights. There aren't many spread cleaving fights where the power of the multi-dotting, of the buffed dots you will have available in 9.1 will actually make up for the nerfing of your main finisher. So for this reason, many Warlocks are expecting to go from Affliction to Destruction. When it comes to Covenants and Legendaries and the likes, they are still mostly staying Night Phase, so it's not that there is a significant change in the power of the Covenant, you know, the power balance in the Covenant. The main thing to take off in the fight between Destruction and Affliction is that with the slightly less important of pure single target and quite a few more ads spawning with very high priority needing to be mowed down very quickly. Things like Havoc of Destruction gain a lot more value compared to Affliction's damage profile, as well as the scaling of Destruction, which has always been pretty good. To be fair, Affliction's scaling isn't bad either, it's just that the nerfs have set him back quite a bit. Talking about nerfs, there is another class we have to look at, because it's Mage. So when it comes to Mage, it does seem like there is also going to be another power shift. Also, the spawn of the nerfs being thrown, rather than given, to Fire Mage. Both Arcane and Frost are taking over Fire, and it is going to be expected that both Arcane and Frost are going to be playable in Sanctum of Domination more so than Fire Mage. Which is also important because this means moving away another spec from Nightfey. Since, Nightfey has been very popular for many specs, this time it's going to be Kyrian and Venthyr for Mage. Particularly handy for Mage that, for example, Venthyr is a very powerful covenant for both Arcane and Frost. So you will even be able to play both specs with the same covenant chosen, which is very important in this day and age when it comes to choosing your covenants. The main issue when it comes to Fire is that Fire was being used in Castodnatria and even in Mythic Plus for its burst, right? They had very powerful burst with Combustion. Because of Kindling, because of the cooldown reduction, it had a basically 60-second cooldown, so every minute you were certain and guaranteed to use Combustion. It could line up with super important things like Sludge Fist's slam on the pillar when he takes double damage, right? So very, very powerful. After the nerfs, Combustion is going to have a longer cooldown. They have gotten a 10-ish%, a bit more nerf on single target, and over a 15% nerf in AoE. All the while, Frost and Arcane have been slowly buffed throughout 9.0 and 9.0.5. This has gotten to the point where Arcane burst damage is stronger than Fire Mage's burst damage. And the problem is that Fire Mage outside burst damage doesn't have much else. And because of this, 9.1 looks to have Arcane Mage beating Fire in single target, beating Fire in burst. It doesn't even require the same uptime of casting spells of Fire Mage because they need to constantly reduce the cooldown of their Combustion with Kindling. And then if you're looking for something else, you have Frost Mage, because Frost Mage has extremely powerful stacked cleave, extremely powerful funnel in the cleave, in the AoE, they can funnel on a single target, very good sustained damage, and because it can share the same covenant of Arcane Mage, unlike Fire, which needs to stay Nightfey, because they need shifting power for their cooldown reduction, it makes it much easier to be able to play Arcane when you need single target, when you need burst, and then switch to Frost when you need cleave and funnel damage and stacked AoE, etc., more so than just playing Fire. Which is why it is a sensible prediction to see another shift of power after Warlock in Mage as well. What about Hunters, then? The other very popular, very played spec when it comes to ranged DPS, especially at the start of Shadowlands. Yes, the switch of power for Hunters goes from their super high power in raid encounters is now going to move on the bench. They are going to be very powerful bench players. They have very good mobility, so they can move around the seats very quickly to make space for the other specs rotating in and out. So it's going to be very, very useful to have a couple of Hunters in your raid roster. On a more serious note, Hunters, as of right now, have Survival as their best performing spec, and that's just about all there is to say. Some people, some doomers, some incurable pessimists pointed out that I knew it. Blizzard is going to give us a legendary bow because they know how shit we're going to be, so they think that this is going to make us happier. Yeah, well, the legendary bow has a single 1 minute special ability. It's like 0.2% of your damage. It's not going to fix anything about the problems in both of the specs, Beast Mastery and Marksmanship. Marksmanship does not scale very well, and it has been nerfed quite a few times. And the hotfix to Wild Spirits not double hitting anymore was a pretty big blow. It has been progressively getting lower and lower. Their single target at this point is very poor. Their AoE is still okay, their burst AoE is still okay, but it's not enough to be considered to be excellent, to be exceptional. And Beast Mastery is even worse. For a long time, due to the problems, due to the issues caused by BFA, people thought that Beast Mastery scales super well in pretty much all content. Beast Mastery does scale super well, back when they have something to attach their scaling, which was BFA, which was their Azerite trait, Dance of Death, which gave them 1 billion agility, pretty much, and corruption. So, scaling of secondary stats, massive inflation of secondary stats through corruption. All of this now is gone. Beast Mastery doesn't have that anymore, so their scaling is significantly reduced. They have gotten some decent buffs, but they were starting from pretty down below the average level of other specs, so right now they're nothing exceptional. Neither are marksmanship hunters, who have not received any buffs, pretty much. So we are back to the same point of before, which is that if you're gonna see hunters in raids, is because pretty much 1 in every 4 players you ever see around the game are hunters, and they can still be used as your slaves to do annoying mechanics of running around, picking up stuff, soaking stuffs, etc, etc. So they're still going to have a use, they're still going to be useful in the raid, even if they are likely to say right now the weakest of all of the ranged DPS specs. They are the weakest, both of them, so they are definitely not in a very powerful spot. It's just not as bad though. It's not as bad as being weak as a feral druid, it's not as bad as being weak as an enhancement shaman when you're playing hunter. Yeah, and back to the point of the popularity, it doesn't matter that the best performing spec is survival. People are still not going to be playing survival. Now, as for the other ranged DPS specs, Elemental has been tagged by many people as the dark horse of 9.1. Not even dark horse at this point, just a very powerful spec, which I have already seen quite a few other players, for example balanced druids, even fire mages and affliction warlocks respec into, because they think it's going to be doing very well in 9.1. I don't think it will altogether. They still lack any sort of valuable raid buffs. They still lack any sort of things that will make you want them in your raid, like immunities or some extremely powerful burst, just like Fire Mage was in 9.0 and Arcane Mage might be in 9.1. Elemental does not have that. So I think it's still going to be playable. It's going to have certainly much more of a relevance compared to the release of 9.0. Remember, that was when basically Elemental Shamans did not have their best in slot legendary for over a month, so their perceived power at the start of the expansion was very much weakened. Very much. And then, of course, let's not forget that they got a pretty hefty buff in 9.0.5. Now they are very powerful in all facets of the game, from single target to cleave to stacked AoE, etc, etc. Very, very powerful. They just lack burst. Very powerful burst. They can have some AoE burst, but it's not that relevant. What you want is single target burst in raid encounters, really, and that's not the strong point of Elemental right now. But it's still gonna be a certainly solid spec, together with Shadow Priest. Shadow Priest has gotten nerfed, just like Affliction. In the same way, their main single target hitter, Devouring Plague, was nerfed, and in return, it's their dots that were buffed. The difference is that Shadow Priest has not been hurt as much compared to Affliction. Malefic Rapture was really the absolute all-star of Affliction, and the nerf is very big, and Shadow Priest is handling this a little bit better. It will certainly not remain as strong as it was. It has lost a little bit. It will not have the same level of power as the first season of Shadowlands, but it's certainly going to be a viable spec. The one we are leaving for last is Balance, because we have mentioned that there's going to be a change in Warlocks. Likely Destruction could take over Affliction, there is going to be a change in Mage, we can see Arcane and possibly Frost over Fire, even with some changes of Covenants, whereas Shadow Priest, not that many changes, even something like Elemental Shaman, not really that many changes when it comes to Covenants or Legendaries, not even Hunters as well. There is a change though for Druid, because right now Ravenous Frenzy is slowly but surely taking over. This is something I mentioned months and months ago. Even, I think, the first times I've started seeing this ability. This was like 10 months ago. This is a shit ability that is eventually going to overtake Convoke the Spirits. Combroke, for friends. This is because it has a very powerful scaling, this ability, giving you percentage damage and percentage haste stacking. Obviously, the deeper you go into the expansion and the beefier your secondary stats become, this is going to gain more and more value, as opposed to Convoke the Spirits, who all it's going to do is just cast a bunch of spells. It has much less synergy with your secondary stats and primary stat growing compared to this one right here. So I said at the time that very likely by the second, or maybe at the end, depending on how things change, at the end of the second tier, Ravenous Frenzy would have taken over Convoke the Spirits. The recent change, with the addition of the Covenant-specific legendaries, seemed to have kicked this possible overtake very early into the tier, because the addition of Sinful Hysteria is what seems to be bridging the gap in the difference between Venthyr Druids and Night Fae Druids. This one is going to make Ravenous Frenzy last longer, and once Ravenous Frenzy ends, you still get 5 extra seconds for free at the end of it. The initial legendary was a little bit weaker because it only gave you the extra duration without the extra 5 seconds. And then Blizzard added the fact that it has an extra 5 seconds for free. So you should have something around a 24-second long Ravenous Frenzy plus 5 seconds extra, 29-second long Ravenous Frenzy. Especially the last 15-ish or so seconds are going to average some 30% haste and 15% more damage, which is quite significant. And what makes it even more significant is that Endless Thirst Conduit exists, and you will be able to get it at 252 item level in 9.1, which means 1.44% more crit per stack. So not only you're getting 30% more damage and 15% more haste in the last 10-15 seconds, you're also going to gain some 15 to 25%, which is, very big. And to cap this all off with very good synergy, it has the same cooldown, 3 minutes, of your Celestial Alignment, and you can now use them together. Celestial Alignment even lasts a little bit less than Ravenous Frenzy, so you can wait to ramp up a little bit, and when you have a little bit more stacks of haste and damage and crit, you can pop Celestial Alignment and go even more ham. This together is going to give Balanced Druid the strongest set of single target burst in the game. Now, some debate can be had about what exactly you consider burst. Do you consider burst 5 seconds or 10 seconds? Because this can be 30 seconds long. Is it even burst if it lasts for 30 seconds? It depends. And the initial sims are pretty self-explanatory. In 9.0.5 and 9.0 as well, Night Fae was the clear winner when it came to sims of Druid, together of course with the Balance of All Things legendary, to synergize with Convoke the Spirits, but in 9.1, with the new legendary Hysteria, it's Venthyr that is easily taking over Night Fae. The only problems, of course, is that this is very clunky to use, because a 3-minute cooldown as your only cooldown for a DPS is very poor in just how many times you get to use it throughout an encounter. Maybe you end up having an encounter that has some 5 or 6 crucial moments where you won't burst, and your Balanced Druid will barely be able to use a couple of them. That's why it's a little bit weaker if you want to look at the power it can have in the encounters compared to something like Balance of All Things and Convoke the Spirits, which can be used more often. So this one is certainly a little bit more on the edge. If I had to take the predictions, I would say that it's much more likely that Destruction and Arcane, either Venthyr or Kyrian, will take over the currently popular specs Affliction and Fire, whereas for Balanced Druid, whether they move away from Night Fae into Venthyr or they stay Night Fae is a little bit more on the fence. It would be pretty good though if we as a people, we as humans, if we manage to drag away 2 very popular specs from Night Fae and make them play Venthyr, would actually rebalance the popularity of Covenants by a lot. If suddenly the main chunk of mages went from Fire to Arcane or Frost playing Venthyr, and the main bunch of Balanced Druids went from Night Fae to Venthyr, it would actually be some pretty significant shift in popularity of Covenants. And finally, I will stop having troubles being invited in Sanguine Depths because everyone wants a fucking Restoration Shaman Venthyr, because nobody playing DPS wants to play a Venthyr. That wouldn't be an issue anymore, so you should root for this one too, unless you like waiting for 15 minutes before you get to form a Sanguine Depths group. That is implying you're even trying to run a Sanguine Depths group, because, yeah, why would you, actually? So for this, we can stop with our overlay of ranged DPS. Initially, I thought, yeah, I can totally squeeze in both range DPS and melee DPS in one video. No, turns out I talk way too much about this, so you're gonna have to split the videos in 2. I am happy, I am satisfied about these changes. If Fire Mage and Balanced Druid, change a little bit their playstyles, we get to see a few more specs that we haven't seen in a while, like Arcane, like Destruction, like Frost Mage. I think it's been a long time coming. particularly for Fire, because Fire is guilty of being super meta in Nyalota as well, and also being popular in Eternal Palace. So we have gone over a year and a half of Fire Mage domination. Affliction gets a pass because in Nyalota and even Eternal Palace it was Destruction that was the main spec, so Affliction having its tier at the start of Shadowlands was okay, was warranted. The only thing that's gonna feel a little bit weird is going to be Hunters, of course. They have gotten pretty powerful by the end of BFA, sure, but you know, in Shadowlands they have dropped off quite quickly. You know, Marksmanship Hunters lost their sharpness after just a few months, and it doesn't seem like they will be getting anything in 9.1, just misery. At the very least, they can get out of this tier with a legendary bow, I guess. That's something. So for now, we will stop here. Tomorrow, very likely, we will follow up this part with the melee DPS and how are they looking, what are some of the bold predictions we can make looking at the 9.1 meta and the next season of Mythic Plus and the new raid, etc, etc. Thank you guys for watching the video, blah blah blah, the usual stuff. If you enjoy the content, leave a subscribe, a like, a comment, and as usual, your personal letters of congratulations to myself. Your Patres is going to be well received, provided it's written in Latin. So, see you guys soon, and in the meantime, now that I think about it though, Shadow Priests have been meta for a bit too long, right? I think it's time to pay another visit to their kneecaps.